There was a little-known animated film released in 1994, the year I was born, called The Lion King. Comment if you've seen it. It's a little bit obscure, but there's a very simple yet profound quote from one of the characters, Mufasa, as he's speaking to his son Simba, that goes, "Everything you see exists together in a delicate balance. As king, you need to understand that balance and respect all the creatures, from the crawling ant to the leaping antelope. When we die, our bodies become the grass, and the antelope eat the grass. And so we're all connected through the circle of life." All jokes aside, if you haven't seen The Lion King, Mufasa and Simba are in fact lions. Now, I remember hearing that line as a kid and promptly forgetting it, as about 10 minutes later into the film, I faced the brutal betrayal and death of Mufasa by his brother Scar. But years later, I've come to realize that Mufasa was onto something. And that something is as obvious as it is easily forgotten. So this will serve as a reference point for us as we continue. In this video, we're going to be taking a pretty deep look at nature, specifically where it can teach us a bit about gardening. And so welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I am Taylor, and a lot of what I talk about and demonstrate on this channel has to do with how we can borrow the abundance and fertility of nature and utilize it in our gardens. If you would like to receive weekly gardening insights and ideas, you can sign up for my email newsletter, linked in the description, or scan the code on the screen. This is a great way to keep up with me and upgrade your gardening practice in bite-sized chunks. But I want us to take a step back a little bit for this video and help us take stock of what nature does that leads to that abundant fertility. And I'll be highlighting 5 lessons from nature that if we don't take a moment to appreciate, will likely remain hidden. And if you're growing in the Northern Hemisphere like me, at the time of releasing this video, you might be taking a knee from the hands-on work of the growing season. So you'll want to put on your classroom hat for this video. I'm gonna start by giving us an overview of these 5 lessons before going on a fairly detailed look into each of them. Something that is often forgotten by gardeners, certainly myself, is the simple fact that when I garden, I'm engaged with highly complex and borderline magical processes that are demonstrated in nature. And one of these processes is that in nature, waste doesn't exist. In fact, everything is utilized at some point or another. And eventually, as Mufasa alluded to, everything returns to the soil. This really grinds against our modern gears because we're very conditioned to label things as useful or useless. But as nature's perspective on waste implies, that's a pretty dangerous assumption, that we think that we could label something as useful or useless. And not to get too deep too quickly, but it's actually a potentially very damaging worldview to believe that useful means valuable and useless means worthless, as if we could even know something's usefulness and value. But as gardeners and as humans, really, we seem to be drawn to things that are immediately apparent and providing visible results. The problem is that many things don't provide immediate visible results. And that's the second lesson that nature teaches us. It's actually the very things that we can't see, microorganisms, that are making most of our effort as gardeners work. Microbes are both largely invisible to the naked eye and invaluable for cultivating healthy soil and plants. That's hidden lesson number 2. The third lesson that I want us to observe from nature is that rather than our intuitive sense that competition and control are the driving factors for our work as gardeners, nature seems to value collaboration much more highly. And it shows us that in some really remarkable ways, many of which people have tried to form into a system with clearly defined rules and measurements that nature largely rejects in favor of patterns that can be recognized and replicated in our gardens if we get ourselves out of the narrow-minded, rules-based approach to gardening. And as we examine this 4th lesson of nature, following patterns, not rules, we'll arrive at the 5th hidden lesson that nature reveals to us, that it values diversity over uniformity at almost every level. So if that sounds like a good roadmap to you, let's dive in. Something that I regularly speak about on this channel is how we can utilize waste streams in favor of building soil. But what nature shows us is that in the natural world, waste streams aren't something that need to be utilized. There's actually no such thing as waste at all. In his book, The One Straw Revolution, Masanobu Fukuoka says, organic remains of plants and animals accumulate and are decomposed on the surface by bacteria and fungi. With the movement of rainwater, the nutrients are taken deep into the soil to become food for microorganisms, earthworms, and other small animals. Plant roots reach to the lower soil strata and draw the nutrients back up to the surface. And again, this should be intuitive. When a squirrel dies in the forest, there's no cleanup crew that is going to come and scrape it off the floor so that no one has to see or smell its rotting body. Instead, billions of microorganisms quickly spring to action in an attempt to consume and decompose the body as quickly as possible. Other scavenger animals might stumble upon the body and eat parts of it as well, but nothing is considered strictly waste. Even the skeleton that remains when the flesh has disintegrated will slowly become brittle and crumble, reintegrating its minerals back into the soil. This concept has been labeled the law of conservation of mass, which basically teaches that matter can change from one state to another, but the total amount stays the same. And with Einstein's theory of relativity, we've learned that mass can be converted to energy or vice versa. But in essence, as I said earlier, this lesson from nature almost doesn't need to be explained. It can be directly observed. In the so-called civilized world, we have expertly designed systems that categorize objects into either something that can be useful or something that is wasteful. And the waste can then be sent away so that we don't have to deal with it. But if we return to nature, if that squirrel's body were scraped up and tossed into a landfill, the food that it had consumed throughout its life, that stored itself in part through the nutrients present in its body, would not be reimparted to the land that they were taken from. In other words, nature never leaves a deficit. And when we categorize things as waste, we're inadvertently causing a deficit, because waste, by definition, is something that has lost its usefulness. And I'll make this really practical here. As gardeners, when we grow food from the soil, those plants are drawing nutrients from the soil. When the plants are harvested and consumed, we've made a withdrawal that needs to be replenished if we expect to be able to make further withdrawals. So to solve this solution, at some level, we need to make deposits back into the soil. Some of you are probably dreading the idea that I'm going to start asking you to compost your own feces, but I'll admit I have not made the leap quite yet to doing so, and this speaks to the powerful effect that societal norms have and the way our brains are geared toward social preservation over ecological preservation. Much like my critique of the American lawn, I think the primary shift that needs to occur in the Western mind is a broad-scale re-examination of our norms in regard to where our urine and feces go and how they're used. This, I believe, is a more difficult task than the lawn issue. But in the long run, we do need to be thinking of ways that we can be shifting the needle toward utilizing our excrement to replenish soil rather than viewing it as a waste stream that needs to be handled separately from ordinary life. I know of many practical solutions and ideas that have been generated in response to this need, from composting toilets to safe and contained composting systems that process human manure effectively. And the truth is that there is significant evidence from most human cultures for most of time of utilizing human manure as their primary source of fertility in growing crops. Please do your research on this topic before you go trying this. And I'll be honest again and say that my expertise is limited on this topic. But I do hope as a society we can begin to destigmatize this concept and move toward a more holistic view of re-imparting nutrients to the soil the way that nature shows us. What's interesting is that really all paths for organic matter lead back to the soil. It's just a matter of how quickly and how locally we want that to occur. We'll touch on some more practical ideas toward the end of this video. Circling back around to the line from Mufasa, when we die, our bodies become the grass. In case you've never thought about it, this begs the question, how exactly does a lion's body become the grass? Well, as you may have guessed where I'm heading with this, it largely comes down to microbes. Microbes refer to the largest domain within the taxonomy of living things. And being so large and widespread, while also remaining largely invisible to the naked eye, it's easy to ignore or forget their presence. It's usually when we get sick or see gross-looking mold on food that we think about bacteria at all, or like a virus that's causing us harm. But the truth is they're pretty much everywhere, on our bodies, in the air, on every surface, inescapable. And that's a good thing, because they, for the most part, wish us no ill will. And in fact, it's usually the opposite. Now, from the moment a living creature dies, microbes are there, ready to start cleaning things up and process the materials so that the next living thing can enjoy the nutrients left behind. And microbes are the essential factor here. Mufasa, it turns out, missed a crucial step in his explanation, because no one would expect to see a lion carcass suddenly transmute into grass, firmly planted in the ground. No one would even expect a lion carcass to start growing grass straight out of it. It first needs to decompose, disappear into the earth, and then grass can grow out of that. Bear with me. I know that's kind of like duh, but again, what we often don't think about is how much work the microbes are actually doing to get the animal carcass to the point where it can become grass. And if you're squeamish or easily bored, you might want to skip to the next lesson, because I'm going to get into some slightly nasty and detailed descriptions of the decomposition process, but I actually think it's necessary if we're going to learn this lesson from nature. What Mufasa should have said was something like this: Simba, when we die, the process of decomposition begins with scavengers and larger insects tearing open muscle tissues, spreading microbes throughout the body. Flies and beetles are going to lay eggs, maggots are going to feed on soft tissue, aerating our carcasses and providing entry for other microorganisms. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and actinomycetes are going to colonize our carcasses and start producing extracellular enzymes that break down proteins, fats, and carbohydrates into simple molecules. Bacteria release enzymes that digest tissue, generating gases like methane and carbon dioxide, which cause bloating and attract yet more decomposed organisms. Fungi and actinomycetes further degrade complex compounds such as lignin and cellulose, which persist after other tissues are consumed. As decomposition progresses, our bodies are reduced to bones, hair, and more resistant tissues, with most soft tissue now broken down. Microbial action continues in and around our remains. Soil bacteria and fungi assimilate carbon and nutrients released, turning them into microbial mass, and then eventually stable soil organic matter. Microbes create humic substances, which are vital for soil structure and water retention. Nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and other minerals in our tissues are mineralized, converted by bacteria into plant-available forms through processes like ammonification and nitrification for nitrogen, and solubilization for phosphorus. And so with time, the nutrients released from our carcasses will be transformed by microbes into minerals and compounds that roots can absorb. Soil microbes form intimate relationships with plant roots, aiding nutrient uptake. For example, mycorrhizal fungi attach to roots and extend into soil, shuttling phosphorus, nitrogen, and water into the plant system. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert as atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium or nitrate, which are forms of nitrogen that are usable by plants. Phosphate-solubilizing microbes break down soil phosphorus, making it accessible for plant roots. Root exudates feed microbes in the rhizosphere, promoting further mineralization of nutrients. And so with available minerals, grass and other plants absorb nutrients through their roots and use them for growth. The energy and nutrients from our carcasses will become part of new life, and thus the circle of life. But instead, he chose the simple explanation, and that's cool too. The thing is, whether you understand that whole process or not, having heard about it, it should make you think, wait a sec, what are fertilizers for then? And that's nature's lesson for us. Microbes feed plants, not fertilizers. When we feed our plants synthetic fertilizers, we're bypassing the whole process that I just explained. And this is far from surprising due to our obsession as humans with compartmentalizing our waste streams away from normal life. Of course, we have a habit of exporting waste and importing raw nutrients. But there's an even greater cost when we do this, and that is that all those processes that microbes perform become unnecessary, and as a result, the microbial cultures in the soil atrophy and disappear over time. It's not as though they can never be reintroduced, but without allowing them to do their job, we lose out on the many other beneficial cofactors involved in the intricate set of processes. And this will lead us into the next lesson that nature reveals to gardens, because as you may have sensed, the process of converting raw materials into plant-available nutrients in the soil is not a linear path. It's more of an interconnected web that fragments and results in an intricate domino effect with second, third, fourth, 50th order effects in the soil, all of which are interdependent and reliant on one another. And that brings us to appreciating the collaborative effort that goes into natural processes, or put differently, nature thrives through collaboration, not just competition. This was pretty revelatory to me when I learned only recently about the way that microorganisms evolve. And I was fortunate to learn about it from a book called The Hidden Half of Nature by Anne Bickley and David Montgomery. In this book, the authors present a history of modern microbiology, where they discuss the transformation through discoveries made by biologist Lynn Margulis at UC Berkeley. Margulis made some really groundbreaking discoveries about the origins of microbial life that led to a significant change in the scientific community's understanding at the time. Rather than the survival of the fittest paradigm, Margulis suggested that cooperation and symbiosis were the original causes of evolutionary breakthrough for microorganisms. She advanced the theory of endosymbiosis, which argues that key cellular structures, such as mitochondria and chloroplasts, originated when distinct bacteria formed symbiotic relationships and merged into the earliest eukaryotic cells. Whereas previous theories focused on competition for resources as the engine of evolution, Margulis's work showed that the merging and collaboration of separate lineages made new forms of life possible. And as is the case with most scientific breakthroughs that disrupt popular models, her research was largely dismissed at first. But thankfully, she stuck to her guns and eventually convinced the community that survival through cooperation was a far more plausible and even demonstrable explanation for the emergence of eukaryotic cells from simpler prokaryotes. In simpler terms, she found certain microbes could consume other microbes only to adopt parts of those microbes' genetic makeup into their own, thus creating new subspecies at rapid pace. This has led us to understand how microorganisms adapt their environments and how they change themselves and interact with other microbes to best fit their environment and serve the plants in that area. So on a microscopic level, we see these organisms working together to survive. Microbes merge with each other to further advance. But then at the plant level, we continue to see collaboration where microbes and plants rely on each other for survival. Mycorrhizal fungi, for example, can't survive without a plant host. Plant root exudates provide valuable food sources for soil microbes. Not only that, but the above ground plant matter provides food for a unique set of co-evolved pollinators. This is yet another example that we can see in nature that collaboration is a more effective lens through which we can observe these processes. Native plants and native pollinators co-evolved for millennia, resulting in, as Mufasa says, a delicate balance. It's only been till recently, the past few hundred years, that the concept of invasive species has arisen, largely, if not entirely, due to humans wanting to grow plants in their environments that haven't had a history of being there. The collaboration that occurred over millions of years of plant and animals co-evolving to supply each other's needs has been suddenly disrupted with the introduction of plants and animals that have no business growing and multiplying unchecked in new environments. Obvious examples in the US are the Florida Everglades, where the Burmese python, for instance, has taken over and dominated the space, causing disbalance in the local ecology. On a more applicable level to home gardeners, at least gardeners in the US, plants like non-native bamboo and English ivy can be devastating if they get out of control because there are few natural ways of stopping it from spreading. In short, the ecology is mismatched when invasive plants, pollinators, or other species are introduced. And this harms that balance by creating environments that are inhospitable to the native species. This is why it's so important to support your local pollinators with a variety of native plants that can actually supply the food needed to support those pollinators. And check your state's registry of invasive species so that you can avoid introducing them where they shouldn't be. This isn't to say non-natives have no place in your garden or that you can only plant natives. It's just to say that we want to be conscious about what parts of our ecology that we're supporting and what we're disrupting. This concept of collaboration should not be as foreign to us as it is, but again, we only need to turn to the organizations that stand to profit from us believing that we're engaged in competition or dominance over our gardens. It's almost in companies like Bayer's best interest to let you grow invasives, only so they can sell you Roundup to help you keep it controlled. And speaking of the big suppliers of home gardening and agricultural inputs, one of the lessons from nature that we've been led to distort comes in the form of an obsession with rules. I remember a comment that we received years ago now on a compost troubleshooting video. We've been trying to heat up our compost pile at the time, and someone had wished that we would have found the solution and demonstrated it for the problem before posting the video, which is totally fair. And a follow-up comment read, if it works for you, it will work for everyone everywhere, because everyone has similar carbon, nitrogen, and water to work with. There's no magic to it. Now, I don't entirely disagree with what this person was saying. In one sense, they were correct. The point that I disagree on still is that the exact same conditions, materials, and climate patterns could arise so as to result in exactly the same processes occurring every time. The reality is that nature follows patterns, not hard and fast rules. Of course, there are basic rules, but even those are just ways that we humans have chosen to categorize and classify what we can observe in order to assert some degree of control. But nature seems largely to transcend our rules. For example, plant spacing. We're conditioned to check the seed packet to find ideal plant spacing, and this can be really helpful for getting a baseline for home gardeners. But we really don't see that kind of specific spacing in nature. Nature tends to grow plants in irregular clusters. Another rule that gets slapped on home gardeners often is this idea that plants need specific nutrients in specific doses as though they're babies on a feeding schedule. But nature follows this pattern that we already looked at in the first lesson of nutrient cycling. It gives and it receives back in a natural cyclical pattern. Watering is an interesting rule that seems to have a lot of gardeners confused. I've certainly been confused. There's sort of this idea that we need to be maybe watering our plants every few hours to keep them alive. But in nature, rainfall and water availability come more in pulses and cycles. There's really no such thing as a watering schedule. It's more like the rainy season and the dry season. Now I'll qualify what I'm saying here because while no rules gardening is a thing, it isn't always realistic for everyone. You probably shouldn't leave rotting animal carcasses across the floor of your food forest in an attempt to be more like nature. And this is where we get to the intersection of nature and gardening. Anytime that we deliberately grow a plant, we're engaging with natural processes and artificial ones. Nature doesn't hand plant seeds. It doesn't protect some plants from pest damage and leave others alone to get munched. Gardening, or any form of agriculture, is a result of technological advancements in plant domestication at some level. In other words, it's not fully natural. The problem is that on that spectrum between the natural and the artificial, our modern systems have led us closer to the artificial than the natural in a lot of ways. And that means that big companies can make bold claims about specific rules that you need to follow so that they can sell you products that help you follow the rules that they created. I've said in other videos that the goal for this channel is not to give you fully copy-paste techniques. It's to actually empower you to try things that apply to your context under your specific conditions. And the same goes with observing nature's patterns. And this is maybe where I diverge a little bit from Fukuoka. I don't think that we really want to copy-paste every single thing that we see in nature into our gardens. So maybe we can observe the pattern from nature that trees self-mulch by dropping their leaves and leaving them there. Rather than never raking your leaves up in our yard, perhaps we could observe the pattern of mulching and apply it. Maybe that means layering the leaves, but it could also mean collecting the leaves, composting them, and then reapplying them as more microbially and nutritionally diverse mulch. There's a high degree of contextualization needed for any pattern that we see. But that's why it's so helpful that nature follows patterns, not rules. Because whereas rules need to be adopted, patterns can be adapted. And one of the most recurring and significant patterns nature reveals is the fifth and final lesson that I want to cover, which is that nature prefers diversity over uniformity. Once more, I'll repeat the sacred words of the Lion King. Everything you see exists in a delicate balance. And that balance is something that we need to understand and respect. It's worth saying that as humans, we're a part of nature, right? And whereas in a lot of ways we've transcended the animal kingdom, we still exist and operate within the delicate balance of the natural world. And as wishy-washy and trite as that sounds, there's a good deal of strength to be found in diversity. A tragic example of the inverse of this can be found in the cultivation of the banana. If you're familiar with the history of the banana, you might know that whereas there are tens of thousands of varieties in existence, only one is widely available in most grocery stores, the Cavendish banana. And in Latin American countries, this banana is grown almost exclusively so that it can be transported and enjoyed by American consumers. However, this banana faces a problem, namely extinction. The fungus Fusarium oxysporum is devastating the Cavendish banana population worldwide, and it spreads so quickly and destroys the trees so quickly that it's expected to eliminate the Cavendish banana over the next few decades. But here's the thing, this doesn't have to happen. The reason the fungus is allowed to spread is because there is only one variety amongst thousands of bananas that exist that is actually being planted. The fungus can spread quickly, host tree to host tree, and then devastate the crop because there's no other breed breaking up the fields. This is not natural in one sense. In another sense, this actually is precisely natural. Nature is taking measure into its own hands and helping the earth balance itself out a bit. The delicate balance isn't understood and respected right now. We've allowed a monocrop virus to spread, and the banana industry is experiencing the consequences. Thing is, this is a surprise to no one. In fact, the banana that we have, the Cavendish, was genetically engineered to withstand a different race of the Fusarium oxysporum that eradicated the previously monocropped banana, the Gros Michel, which largely replaced in the 1950s. When we plant one specific variety of crop, we create a fragile system. With many species, subspecies, and varieties of plants, not to mention microorganisms, nature holds a perfect balance that is worth modeling. This doesn't mean that we can't be planting more than one of each plant or plant variety, but we can be thinking of ways that we're diversifying the botanical and microbial quality of our growing space. Planting lots of different types of natives, as I mentioned earlier, testing heirloom varieties of annuals and saving seeds, welcoming in pollinators and plants specifically planted for them, are just a few of the ways that we can replicate the model that nature lays out for us. Interplanting in garden beds to create systems where plants rely on each other for shade, pest protection, and disease reduction, using different types of mulches, ingredients in our compost piles, using leaf mold, soil found in nature to culture and apply to the garden are ways that we could increase the microbial diversity of our soil. And this is such a big topic that it's hard to know quite where to start. The main thing is just starting. Taking one step at a time, one season at a time. And this applies to each of the lessons that nature teaches us. The main takeaway from this video, if you've made it to this point, is recognizing that nature is worth observing and replicating if we want to bring our gardens to their fullest potential. If you can take one thing from each of these lessons and actually apply it to your garden, you'll be moving in that direction. For the first lesson, no waste in nature, maybe that means that you start collecting your fruit and veggie scraps to compost. Maybe it means that you cancel your yard waste service and try to find a way to use every piece of yard debris in some way. That would be a big step. For lesson number 2, microbes over fertilizer, maybe it means you take a break from applying your fertilizer and you put down an organic mulch for the microbes to feed on for a season and see what happens. From lesson 3, collaboration over competition, could you choose one native perennial to grow in your garden next season? Do a little research and see what pollinators that you may or may not be supporting and find the plant that supports them. If you have no idea where to start, look up the variety of milkweed that's native to your area. There are 100 species native to North America alone, and they serve as the sole food source for the monarch butterfly larva. Visit a local nursery and pick up some seeds. This doesn't need to be an all or nothing. I know this video has been pretty technical, and I apologize if it confused you or worse yet, bored you. But if you heard something from this video, try to write down how you could actually take action on that thing to bring your garden closer to nature. We barely scratched the surface here, but it's a niche that needs to be scratched. And with that, we're gonna wrap things up. If you're coming to the end of this video and something struck a chord, maybe there is one thing that you want to try growing next season or this growing season, if you're watching this right in the middle of yours, tell us in the comments. It'd be great to hear from you and get to hear what other people are planning on doing. Go watch The Lion King if you haven't in a while or ever. And as always, thank you for watching this video, and we'll see you in the next one.